The biggest problem for some of these big studios like EA, Ubisoft, Activision is that a lot of them have huge numbers of people employed in freakishly expensive areas of the world. And just like the median salary in some of those studios has to be over $120,000 just to get somebody to be able to like make ends meet, which I know it's insane for some people. It's like 120,000 and you're making ends meet. Yeah. In some of these places like San Fran, you're not living like a king on $120,000. I hate to tell you, like your average apartment is like $3,000, $4,000 a month. Like it's crazy. It's crazy. San Fran is freakishly expensive to live in. And so when you have an entire studio built there, you're spending so much money just for the staff. And that adds up a lot when you're talking about like a 3, 4, 5-year development cycle. And then you compare it to like, let's see, you compare it to some of these other studios. Yeah, FromSoftware. This is published October 4th, 2024. The Japanese developer just gave a raise to their employees. So their starting salary for new graduates will go from $1,775 in US dollars, just under $1,800 a month, to $2,050 a month. So they're able, this is in 2022, they announced that they had roles advertised at FromSoftware starting at $1,500 a month. So FromSoftware is able to hire people at these rates, nowadays at these rates. And then in San Fran, they're paying like junior employees $70,000, $80,000, $90,000 because that's just what you have to pay them in order to live there. Starts to make sense how they could get so freaking expensive so quickly, right? Compared to being able to pump something out with like FromSoftware, where you can pay very talented people very, very low. Partially because they have the reputation they do, so a lot of people want to work there to get a game like that on their resume, and then also because it's just more standard there, So I just, whenever I see people all the time being like, well, FromSoftware managed to make this game and they only charge $60 for it. It's like, yeah, but they also paid very, very little. Okay, so like, let's just understand what we're talking about, People I've spoken to who work at like EA, for example, make pretty good money, at least within like the dev teams. They make decent money for what they're doing. Whereas some of these other studios, it's like, oh, are they in Tokyo? Yeah, I believe so. China's even cheaper. I believe so. I believe so. It's part of the reason why companies like NetEase, there's just this story where they're looking at potentially closing more than a dozen studios worldwide, specifically outside of their core Chinese market. But they're looking at firing and shutting down a lot of its non-Chinese studios. Quote, many of them, the very same ones that announced titles over the last 3 years. Two people familiar with the company's efforts tell GameFile. Neither individual was authorized to speak, blah, blah, blah. But they're looking at laying off and shutting down studios internationally because, like, especially after Black Myth Wukong, it sort of maybe reignited excitement within the investor pool in China, because they realized, oh, we can pump out some massive games that will be successful in the West and the East. Bada bing, bada boom. Why would we go elsewhere when we can do it way more affordably if we just stay in China? And also within China, I mean, they're not big fans of letting their companies spend a ton of money on outside like acquisitions and stuff. There's all sorts of regulatory things. It's why like Tencent has had to buy shares of big companies, but they haven't bought out a lot of companies. So if you look at them, like they own huge shares in Embracer, they own huge shares in Ubisoft, in pretty much, I mean, frankly, any gaming company, media company you can think of. Tencent probably owns a chunk of them, but they're not buying out those companies. They are buying a chunk and then they kind of sit with that. Chinese gaming industry is an untapped pool of riches. Yeah, and they're starting to realize that they can tap it real quick and rock and roll. Black Myth sold 7 million in the West, 40% of sales. Yeah, Reinhardt, and I think a lot of investors, especially in China for a long time, thought that there wasn't really a way to break through, and that, Chinese games were popular with Chinese audiences, but they wouldn't really break into the Western markets. But now with Black Myth especially, they've realized, oh, You can. And then you look elsewhere and you're like, oh, Marvel Rivals is popping off. Oh, and it just starts to snowball. And I think that that's why in like 5 years, I wouldn't be surprised if the big companies that are dominating a lot of the annual releases are not like American or French or European companies. My guess is it's going to be a lot of companies from like Korea, Japan, China. It's just going to continue to take over, which more competition is good. Like if it forces companies like Ubisoft, EA, Activision to like wake up and raise their standards, I'm down for it. But that's just what it's going to take is until World War III kicks off. Yeah, unfortunately. So anyway, it's just the industry's changing and you got to be buckled up for it because it's changing fast and it's not going to wait for you. I'll tell you what.